There's a story carved into clay tablets older than the pyramids, older than anything we typically associate with ancient civilization. For decades, you've probably heard one version of this story, a version involving ancient aliens, genetic experiments, and extraterrestrial gold miners. But tonight, I want to show you what these tablets actually say when you read them in their own language, through their own symbols, without the filter of modern agendas. What you're about to discover might surprise you. It's not the story that made it onto television or into best-selling books. But I think you'll find it far more fascinating than the fiction that's been sold as fact. Let me take you on a journey to the very edge of human memory, to the moment when our species first tried to write down its understanding of where everything came from. Before we begin, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know where in the world you're watching from and what drew you to this topic. I'm genuinely curious about who's interested in these ancient mysteries. And if you find value in what we explore together tonight, a like would help this reach others who are searching for authentic history rather than sensationalized stories. Let me paint you a picture of southern Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. You're standing on flat plains between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The landscape stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by the massive temple platforms rising from the cities. The air is hot and dry. Your entire existence depends on whether those rivers will flood this year at the right time, bringing the rich mountain soil that makes agriculture possible in this otherwise harsh environment. This is where humans first learned to write. Not to compose poetry or record grand histories, but to track grain deliveries and count sheep. These people lived intimately with water in ways we modern city dwellers can barely comprehend. When the rivers flooded correctly, life flourished. When they didn't, people starved. Water was survival itself, immediate and visceral. So when these ancient Sumerians contemplated the origins of existence, when they looked back beyond the founding of their cities to imagine what came before everything, they naturally conceived of water as the primal element. Not water as we know it, flowing in rivers or filling our cups, but water as pure creative potential, the substance from which all possibilities emerged. They called this primordial state Namu. And understanding what Namu represented requires us to think differently about what divinity meant to these ancient people. Namu wasn't a goddess in the way we typically imagine deities today, with human form and personality, with likes and dislikes, with the anthropomorphic characteristics that make gods relatable to worshippers. Namu was something more fundamental and abstract. She was the cosmic ocean, the endless waters that existed before creation itself had meaning. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to describe what existed before space itself, before dimensions, before the concepts of up and down or left and right had any meaning. This is what the Sumerians were grappling with when they described Namu. A nothingness that was simultaneously everything. A cosmic sea containing all potential but manifesting nothing, waiting in timeless suspension for the moment when creation would begin. What makes this particularly fascinating from a theological perspective is that Namu was complete in herself. She required no partner, no divine marriage, no joining of opposites to bring forth the universe. In many ancient mythological systems, creation requires a sacred couple. The Sky Father mates with the Earth Mother, and from their union comes the world we know. But the Sumerians, at least in their earliest traditions, described something different. Some scholars have suggested this represents a memory of an even earlier religious tradition in Mesopotamia, perhaps one that predated Sumerian civilization itself. A tradition emphasizing female creative power and seeing the cosmos emerging from a single divine source rather than from dualistic principles. From Namu's own essence, the texts tell us, Kamen, representing the sky and heavens, and Ki, embodying the earth itself. These weren't yet gods in the fully personal sense. They were fundamental forces of nature given divine status, cosmic principles made manifest, the basic building blocks of reality. Here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something profound about how the Sumerians understood creation. An enki existed initially in perfect unity, heaven and earth joined together in an undifferentiated mass, locked in eternal embrace. There was no space between them, no atmosphere, no realm where life could exist or flourish. From the union of an enki came Enlil, whose name translates as Lord of the Air or Master of the Breath. And Enlil's role in creating the cosmos as we know it was absolutely fundamental and, according to Sumerian understanding, necessarily violent. Think about this carefully. Creation couldn't proceed through gentle evolution or gradual development. It required rupture, a breaking apart, a forceful separation of what had been unified. Enlil thrust the sky upward, pushing it away from Ki, and in doing so created the space between them. The air, the atmosphere, the realm where weather happens and birds fly and humans breathe. This act of separation was the true beginning of the ordered cosmos. The moment when potential became actual, when the undifferentiated unity of the primordial state gave way to the multiplicity and diversity of creation, and was carried away, rising upward to establish his domain in the celestial realm far above the earth, while Enlil claimed the air between, the space where wind and storm and breath itself originated. This three-tiered structure of heaven, earth, and the air between them formed the basic architecture of Sumerian cosmology. It's simpler in some respects than later Greek or Indian cosmologies with their multiple heavens and elaborate celestial hierarchies. But it captured something essential about the observable world. There was the sky above, unreachable, home to the sun and moon and stars. There was the earth below, the realm of human activity and agricultural labor. And there was the air between, invisible but absolutely essential, the medium through which rain fell and seeds traveled and breath moved. If you're finding this different from what you've heard in popular media, I hope you'll consider sharing this video with others who might appreciate learning what these ancient texts actually say. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how this compares to other creation stories you're familiar with. Now here's where things become truly intriguing. The texts, when we examine them closely with attention to their nuances, reveal something fascinating about the Sumerian understanding of time and creation. Before Enlil's act of separation, before this ordered cosmos with its clear divisions was established, there was a period that the Sumerians themselves struggled to describe, a period for which they lacked adequate vocabulary or conceptual frameworks. The tablets speak of a time when only water existed, when the boundaries between salt water and fresh water had not yet been established, when the cosmic ocean was undifferentiated and all-encompassing. Later Babylonian texts, composed perhaps 1,000 years after the earliest Sumerian narratives, personified this primordial water as two distinct beings. Apsu, representing fresh underground water, and Tiamat, embodying the salt water of the sea. But in the older Sumerian tradition, Namu preceded even this division. She was the totality of the primordial waters before any distinction had been made, before the categories that would structure later cosmological thinking had been established. This suggests that Sumerian creation mythology, in its earliest forms, was more monistic than the later Babylonian versions, seeing ultimate reality emerging from a single source rather than from the interaction of dualistic principles. Archaeological evidence from excavations conducted over the past century and a half supports the profound antiquity of these beliefs and connects them to real geographical locations. The city of Eridu, located in southern Iraq near what was once the Persian Gulf shoreline, but which is now many miles inland due to millennia of sediment deposition, was considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, the birthplace of civilization itself. Modern excavations have confirmed that Eridu indeed represents one of the earliest urban settlements in human history, with occupation levels dating back to approximately 5,400 years before the Common Era. That makes it contemporary with, or even slightly older than the famous site of Uruk to the north. The patron deity of Eridu was Enki, also known by the Akkadian name Ea in later periods. Enki was the god of wisdom, of fresh water flowing beneath the earth and emerging in springs, of creation and crafts and magical knowledge. He occupied a special place in the Sumerian pantheon, often portrayed as cleverer than the other gods, more willing to help humanity, less bound by the rigid hierarchies and protocols that govern divine society. He was a trickster in some respects, a subversive force who worked around the decrees of more powerful but less imaginative gods to achieve what he believed were just outcomes. Enki's temple in Eridu bore the name Iabzu, literally, House of the Cosmic Deep Waters. This wasn't merely a poetic name or symbolic designation. The temple was believed to be built upon the very spot where the primordial waters of the Abzu first emerged into the terrestrial world, where the boundary between the cosmic ocean existing beneath all land and the realm of human habitation was thinnest and most permeable. Priests conducting rituals in this temple, performing daily services to the god, making offerings and reciting hymns in the ancient Sumerian language, believed they were standing at nothing less than the axis of creation, the point where the ordered world of cities and agriculture and civilization touched the primal chaos that had preceded it and that still existed beneath the thin veneer of order. Understanding the significance of this location and belief system is essential for grasping Sumerian cosmology and its relationship to the physical landscape these people inhabited. The ancient Sumerians, living over 5,000 years ago when writing was still a recent invention and cities were a relatively new form of human organization, conceived of their world as resting upon and emerging from a cosmic ocean of fresh water. This wasn't merely abstract theology disconnected from observable reality. It was grounded in their actual experience of the environment. Below the earth, they believed, stretched the Abzu, an endless expanse of subterranean waters from which all springs, rivers, and wells ultimately flowed. When they dug wells to reach water for drinking and irrigation, when they observed springs bubbling up from beneath the ground, when they traced rivers back to their sources in the mountains and imagined what lay beneath those sources, they envisioned this cosmic ocean, infinite and primordial, the same waters that had existed before creation itself. The Mesopotamian plain is characterized by a remarkably high water table, and the Sumerians observed through direct experience that when they dug deep enough anywhere in their territory, they invariably found water. From this observation, repeated countless times across generations, they constructed a cosmology in which the entire world floated upon or was surrounded by primordial waters, in which dry land was essentially an island or a bubble in an infinite ocean. The sky above was conceived as a solid dome, perhaps made of some crystalline substance, arching over the earth and keeping the waters above from falling down and drowning the world. Below the earth were the waters of the Abzu, held back by the solid foundation of the world but always present, always threatening to break through if the cosmic order failed. This cosmological model made profound sense given the Sumerian experience of floods, particularly the catastrophic inundations that could occur when the Tigris and Euphrates rivers overflowed their banks simultaneously, transforming the flat plains into an inland sea. During such floods, which are well documented in ancient texts and can be traced in archaeological layers at multiple Mesopotamian sites, the world quite literally returned to a watery state, with only the raised tells where cities stood remaining above the floodwaters. Now we come to one of the most important texts for understanding how the Sumerians believed humanity came into existence. This is where the difference between authentic ancient sources and modern reinterpretations becomes absolutely crucial, so I want to walk through this carefully. The text known as Enki and Ninmah provides detailed information about the creation of humanity, information that predates and provides essential context for any later stories involving divine beings and their relationship with humans. This remarkable composition describes a time when the gods, specifically the lesser or junior gods occupying lower ranks of the divine hierarchy, were burdened with backbreaking work. They dug canals to channel water for irrigation. They piled up silt to create foundations for temples and cities. They crushed clay to make bricks for building. And they complained bitterly about their toil, about the endless labor that left them exhausted and miserable. The text begins with a formula establishing the deep antiquity of the events it describes. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, in those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years, in the years when the fates were determined. This opening situates the story at the very beginning of cosmic time, immediately after the basic structure of reality had been established, but before the world had taken its final form. The senior gods, the great deities like En and Enlil who held supreme positions in the divine hierarchy, oversaw the work while the minor gods bore the actual toil, performing the physical labor that cosmic order required. This divine hierarchy, with its stark division between gods who commanded and gods who labored, existed before humanity entered the picture, before humans had been created to serve any purpose whatsoever. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, lay sleeping in the deep waters of the Abzu, in the subterranean cosmic ocean that was his special domain, completely unaware of the complaints and suffering of the laboring gods. His mother Namu, that primordial deity who had existed before creation itself, gathered the tears of these suffering divine beings, collected their complaints and anguish, and brought them to her son, rousing him from his sleep in the depths to address this problem that threatened to disrupt the cosmic order. "Can you really lie there sleeping?" she asked him, "while the gods groan under their labor, while their tears fall uncollected, while cosmic order teeters on the edge of revolt?" Enki's solution to this divine labor crisis was both ingenious and fateful. He proposed creating a substitute workforce, beings who would relieve the gods of their backbreaking labor, who would take over the agricultural and construction work necessary to maintain the cosmos, but that the gods found so burdensome. Working in collaboration with Namu and with the birth goddess Ninmah, also known by the names Ninhursag and Nintu in different contexts and periods, Enki fashioned the first humans from clay taken from the top of the Abzu, from the primordial waters themselves, from the same cosmic substance that had existed before creation. I want you to pause and consider the significance of this detail, because it reveals something profound about what the Sumerians believed concerning human nature and human origins. Humanity, according to this creation account, was formed from the most primal substance available, from clay infused with the essence of the cosmic waters that predated all ordered existence. We were not made from some lesser or degraded material, not assembled from the corpses of defeated demons, as in some other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, but crafted from the same primordial stuff that the gods themselves had emerged from. The birth goddesses, divine midwives skilled in the creation of life, nipped off portions of this sacred clay, and through a process the text describes in somewhat obscure terms involving divine spittle and perhaps blood, human beings came into existence. This creation narrative provides essential context for understanding later stories about divine beings and their role in human affairs. And it's completely different from what you've probably heard in popular media. What happens next in the text of Enki and Ninmah reveals something fascinating about how the Sumerians understood creation itself, and it stands in stark contrast to modern reinterpretations that portray human creation as a precise, planned genetic engineering project. After successfully making functional humans who could perform the required agricultural labor, after demonstrating that this new solution to the divine labor problem actually worked, Enki and Ninmah engage in a contest, a divine competition where each tries to create beings with various deficiencies or unusual characteristics, challenging the other to find appropriate roles for them in society. Ninmah creates people who are blind, unable to see the work they're supposed to do. She creates people who are paralyzed, unable to move their limbs to perform labor. She creates people with various other physical impairments, each presenting a challenge to the divine plan for human utility. And Enki, demonstrating his characteristic wisdom and adaptability, finds appropriate roles for each of them in society, showing that even those who cannot perform standard agricultural labor have value and can contribute to the community in other ways. Then Enki takes his turn, creating beings with his own peculiar characteristics, strange entities that push the boundaries of what human means, and challenges Ninmah to care for them and find their place in the cosmic order. This story, strange and perhaps even disturbing to modern sensibilities that prefer creation narratives to describe perfect divine acts producing perfect results, actually addresses profound questions about disability, purpose, social inclusion, and the place of all humans in the cosmic order, not just those who are healthy and able-bodied. It reflects a theological worldview that didn't see creation as a single perfect act producing an ideal final form, but as an ongoing process subject to adjustment and improvement, requiring experimentation and adaptation. It shows gods who are creative and adaptable, who learn and problem solve, who engage actively with creation rather than simply decreeing it into existence from a position of aloof omnipotence. This experimental, process-oriented approach to creation is far more nuanced and sophisticated than the interpretation promoted in ancient astronaut literature, which typically portrays human creation as a deliberate genetic engineering project carried out according to a predetermined plan with specific goals and parameters clearly defined from the start. If you're noticing how different this authentic version is from what you've encountered in popular books or television shows, I'd appreciate your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who might benefit from learning what these texts actually say, please consider sharing this video with them. Another crucial Sumerian text, known as the Debate Between Sheep and Grain, provides additional context for understanding the early state of human existence before civilization reached its developed form, before the gifts that would make urban life possible had been granted to humanity. This composition describes the world before agriculture had been established, before the domestication of animals had transformed human diet and economy, before the establishment of the productive economic systems that would characterize Sumerian cities and make them centers of wealth and power. In the beginning, the text tells us, the earth was barren, offering nothing to sustain human life. There was no grain growing in fields, no wheat or barley that could be harvested and ground into flour for bread. There were no sheep providing wool for clothing and milk for nourishment, no goats climbing the hills, no cattle pulling plows through rich earth. People went naked because they had no fibers to weave into cloth, no hides to tan into leather, no protection from sun and cold except what they could improvise from reeds and wild plants. They ate grass for nourishment like animals, chewing tough wild plants that filled their bellies but provided little real sustenance, drinking water from ditches and streams without benefit of wells or irrigation systems. This was humanity in its most primitive state according to Sumerian understanding, before the gods had granted them the technologies and knowledge that would enable civilization. Humans existed, certainly, but they lived barely above the level of animals, without the tools and techniques that would allow them to transcend their natural limitations and create something new, something that had never existed before in the natural world. Then, according to the text, the gods Ashnan and Lahar, who personified grain and sheep respectively, were created specifically to provide sustenance for humanity, to lift humans from their primitive state and enable them to live more comfortably, more securely, more abundantly. The establishment of agriculture, the cultivation of wheat and barley, the domestication of sheep and goats, represented a transformation in human existence, a movement from a state of bare survival, in which every day was a struggle to find enough food, to a condition of productive culture in which surpluses could be generated, stored, and redistributed, supporting specialization of labor and the growth of cities. This transformation, according to the Sumerian texts when we read them attentively and in proper cultural context, occurred through divine intervention, through the deliberate choice of the gods to improve human conditions, to grant humans the knowledge and resources they needed to build something approaching civilization. This brings us to the critical question that this entire exploration has been building toward. Where do the Anunnaki fit into this cosmological framework? When do they appear in the divine genealogy? What roles did they actually play in Sumerian theology? The answers to these questions completely demolish the modern ancient astronaut interpretation that has become so popular in recent decades. So let me walk through this carefully and methodically, because the evidence is clear and decisive. The Anunnaki, according to actual Sumerian texts, when we read them carefully in their original language or in responsible scholarly translations, were not the first gods by any stretch of the imagination. They were not even the second generation of deities. They appear relatively late in the divine genealogy, as offspring of already established gods, members of the third or fourth generation, depending on how we count the generations starting from Namu. The word Anunnaki itself, contrary to the popular modern interpretations promoted by ancient astronaut theorists, does not mean those who came down from heaven to earth, or those who from heaven came. This translation, which has become almost canonical in pseudo-archaeological circles, is simply incorrect. It represents either a fundamental misunderstanding of Sumerian grammar and etymology, or a deliberate mistranslation designed to support a predetermined conclusion about ancient astronauts. The term Anunnaki actually derives from Sumerian elements that translate more accurately as princely blood, seed of An, or offspring of the prince, referring to their status as descendants of An, the sky god whose name means heaven itself. Every reputable Sumerian dictionary, every scholarly analysis of the term, every expert who has devoted their career to understanding this ancient language confirms this etymological derivation. This isn't a matter of interpretation or theoretical framework. It's basic linguistics, straightforward etymology that any competent student of Sumerian could verify. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the pioneering giants of Sumerian studies who devoted his entire career to translating and interpreting Sumerian texts, identified the Anunnaki as belonging to a specific category within the broader and more complex Sumerian pantheon. They were associated particularly with judgments of the dead, with the dark realm of the underworld where all mortals eventually traveled, and with the determination of fate and destiny. In this role, they functioned as spirits of the earth, as chthonic deities whose domain was beneath the surface world, as the seven who decree, sitting in judgment over the souls of the deceased. This characterization is very far indeed from the extraterrestrial miners and genetic engineers of modern ancient astronaut theory, from the gold-seeking aliens from the planet Nibiru, who supposedly came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago to extract precious metals, and who created humanity through genetic manipulation to serve as a slave workforce. The texts describe the Anunnaki as children of the primordial deities, born into a cosmos that already possessed structure and order, occupying a specific niche within an already established divine hierarchy, performing particular functions within the cosmic order rather than creating that order themselves. Before the Anunnaki entered the mythological narrative in their later well-defined roles, the Sumerian texts describe a world populated by other divine beings, by the gods who emerged directly from the primordial state and who established the fundamental patterns of existence. The earliest gods included not just Enki and Enlil, whom we've already discussed, but also figures like Nana, the moon god whose monthly cycle governed the Mesopotamian calendar. There was Utu, the sun god who brought light and warmth to the world, who was associated with justice and truth because the sun's light revealed everything hidden. There was Inanna, perhaps the most complex and fascinating goddess in the entire Sumerian pantheon, the deity of love and warfare, of fertility and destruction, of the planet Venus, whose appearance as both morning and evening star made her seem like two different entities. These deities, along with many others whose names and characteristics fill the god lists and hymns that have survived from ancient Mesopotamia, established the fundamental patterns of existence long before the Anunnaki appear in mythological narratives as a distinct group. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, provides an intriguing window into the period before familiar historical narrative begins. This ancient document, composed during the third dynasty of Ur around 2,100 years before the Common Era but drawing on much older sources, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening formula establishes kingship itself, the institution of centralized political authority exercised by a single ruler, as a divine institution rather than a human invention. Kingship didn't emerge from social contracts or political agreements among early humans. It didn't develop gradually through the evolution of tribal leadership. It descended from heaven, was given as a gift from the gods to humanity, appeared fully formed as a divinely ordained system of governance. But then, after establishing this theological principle about the divine origins of kingship, the Sumerian king list does something extraordinary that has puzzled and fascinated scholars since the document was first discovered and translated. It names 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, antediluvian rulers whose reigns stretched across seemingly impossible spans of time. The first of these antediluvian kings, a figure named Alulim, who ruled in the sacred city of Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years according to the traditional interpretation of the Sumerian sexagesimal numerical system. His successor, Alaungar, reigned for 36,000 years. The third king ruled for 43,200 years. Their combined reigns totaled 241,200 years. Modern scholars have naturally struggled to make sense of these numbers, which seem to exist beyond any reasonable interpretation as actual chronological data. Some have suggested they should be understood symbolically rather than literally, that they represent qualities or achievements rather than years. Others have proposed that the term we translate as year might have represented a different unit of time in the original context. But there's another possibility that deserves serious consideration, one that the Sumerians themselves might have intended. These antediluvian rulers may have been understood as existing in a fundamentally different temporal framework than the post-flood kings, as inhabiting a kind of mythological time that operated according to different principles than historical time. The Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize a sharp distinction between the world before the flood and the world after it, treating them as fundamentally different epochs operating under different cosmic conditions. Before the deluge, the texts suggest through various subtle indicators and explicit statements, the rules governing existence were different in ways we can barely comprehend. Time itself flowed differently, not subject to the same constraints and limitations that govern our experience. Life operated on different principles, with lifespans extended far beyond what would later become normal. The boundary between the divine and mortal realms was less rigid, less absolute, more permeable, allowing for direct contact and interaction that would become increasingly rare in the post-flood world. The Eridogenesis, the oldest surviving narrative of the Great Deluge, provides crucial details about this transitional moment in cosmic history, about the destruction of the old order and the establishment of the new. After humanity multiplied and cities prospered under divine patronage, their noise disturbed the gods. And here I need to be completely clear about what the texts actually say, because this detail is crucial for understanding Sumerian theology. The gods didn't decide to destroy humanity because humans were evil or sinful in a moral sense, because they had violated divine commandments or fallen from an initial state of grace. The motivation was much more mundane and, in some ways, more disturbing. Humans were too numerous, too successful, too vibrant with life and activity. They filled the world with noise that kept the gods awake, that disturbed divine peace and tranquility. Enlil, the powerful god of air and storms who held supreme authority over the earth realm, found himself unable to sleep because of the constant tumult of human civilization. The cities were too crowded, he complained to the divine assembly. Humans were too loud, too busy, too present everywhere. Their noise rose up to the heavens where gods dwelt, making rest impossible. And so, after consulting with other senior gods and receiving their grudging agreement, Enlil made the catastrophic decision to destroy humanity with a great flood that would sweep over the land, wiping away the cities and their noisy inhabitants, returning the world to the quiet primordial state it had enjoyed before humans multiplied so abundantly. But one god disagreed with this decision to annihilate humanity completely. Enki, the lord of wisdom and sweet water, the clever god who often appeared more sympathetic to humanity than his peers, believed that total destruction was excessive punishment. He recognized that humans served a useful purpose, performing the agricultural labor that the gods themselves had found burdensome, maintaining the temples and making offerings that sustained divine existence in the mortal realm. The texts portray Enki as a trickster figure in this episode, clever and subversive, willing to circumvent the decrees of more powerful, but less imaginative gods when he believed they were making a terrible mistake. He couldn't openly defy Enlil's decree, because the decision had already been made, and divine decrees were understood to be irrevocable once pronounced. But he could work around it, finding loopholes, using his characteristic cunning. Enki appeared to Ziusudra, the king of Shuruppak, who was the last of the antediluvian rulers. Different versions describe this crucial revelation in slightly different ways, but the essence remains consistent. In some versions, Enki comes to Ziusudra in a dream. In other versions, he positions himself on one side of a reed wall that forms part of Ziusudra's house, speaking loudly as if talking to the wall itself, while Ziusudra on the other side overhears what is being said. This elaborate subterfuge, this careful maneuvering around the technicalities of divine law, shows the Sumerian gods as bound by their own rules and precedents, not operating with complete freedom to do whatever they wish at any moment. The message was clear: a flood was coming. The assembly of the gods had decreed humanity's destruction. But Ziusudra could save himself, his family, and representatives of all living species by building a great boat according to divine specifications. When the flood arrived, it came with a violence that the text describes in vivid terms. All the evil winds gathered together, every stormy blast from every direction, converging into a single catastrophic force. For 7 days and 7 nights the deluge continued without pause, the massive boat tossing about on the great waters while outside the world drowned. When the storm finally ended, when the waters began to recede, Ziusudra opened a window in the great boat to see what remained. The sun god Utu sent his blessed light into the vessel's dark interior. Ziusudra emerged, and his first action, the text tells us, was to perform sacrifices to the gods. He butchered oxen as offerings. He lavished sheep, presenting multiple animals as thanksgiving. He prepared barley cakes and crescent-shaped bread. He burned juniper, that pure plant of the mountains whose fragrant smoke was believed to be particularly pleasing to gods. This detail about immediate sacrifice being Ziusudra's first priority after surviving the apocalypse is profoundly important for understanding the Sumerian religious worldview. Even though the gods, specifically Enlil, had decreed humanity's complete destruction, even though divine action had caused the catastrophe that killed everyone except this single family, the proper response of the survivor was worship and propitiation and thanksgiving. The Sumerian worldview didn't include a concept of gods as purely benevolent protectors who always acted in humanity's best interest. The divine powers were recognized as capricious, sometimes helpful and sometimes hostile, sometimes preserving life and sometimes destroying it according to their own inscrutable purposes. But they were always deserving of respect and worship, always demanding propitiation regardless of their actions, because they were gods and humans were utterly dependent on their favor. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating context for these textual traditions, grounding the mythology in actual historical events, even while recognizing that the stories themselves have been shaped by centuries of theological reflection. Excavations at several Mesopotamian sites, including Shuruppak itself, have revealed clear evidence of significant flooding events dating to around 2,900 years before the Common Era, right at the transition between the Jemdet-Nasr period and the early dynastic period when Sumerian civilization was consolidating. The flood deposits don't represent a worldwide deluge in the geological sense. They're evidence of catastrophic but geographically limited flooding in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. But for the people who experienced these floods directly, who watched the rivers overflow their banks and spread across the flat plains for miles in every direction, who saw their fields and homes and temples submerged underwater, these events would have seemed genuinely world-ending. Now we come to the person primarily responsible for transforming this authentic ancient tradition into the modern ancient astronaut narrative, Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was a Russian-born businessman and self-taught amateur scholar who published his first book, The 12th Planet, in 1976. He claimed to have translated Sumerian cuneiform tablets himself, presenting himself as someone with special access to these texts and special ability to understand what they really meant beneath the surface level that professional scholars accepted. His actual qualifications to translate Sumerian were, to put it charitably, questionable. He had a degree in economics from the University of London, not in ancient languages or archaeology, or any field directly relevant to understanding Mesopotamian texts. He had no formal training in Sumerian or Akkadian. He hadn't studied under recognized experts in the field. He hadn't published his translations in peer-reviewed academic journals where other specialists could evaluate his work and point out errors. Nevertheless, Sitchin claimed that his translations revealed a hidden truth that mainstream scholars either couldn't see or deliberately suppressed. According to his central thesis, the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a hypothetical planet he called Nibiru, also sometimes referred to as Planet X. This planet, according to Sitchin, orbits our sun in a highly elliptical path that brings it close to Earth approximately once every 3,600 years. These alien beings, he claimed, arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago during the Middle Pleistocene epoch, when early humans were still evolving in Africa and modern Homo sapiens did not yet exist. They came with a specific purpose: to mine gold from Earth's crust, extracting this precious metal that they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. Eventually, being accustomed to a more pleasant lifestyle and growing tired of backbreaking labor, they rebelled against this work. The solution was the creation of human beings through genetic engineering, splicing Anunnaki DNA with that of Homo erectus to produce Homo sapiens as a hybrid species capable of intelligent thought and complex labor. It's a compelling narrative in many ways, certainly more dramatic than scholarly interpretations of ancient creation myths. But here's the fundamental problem that demolishes this entire edifice of interpretation. Sitchin's translations and readings of Sumerian texts have been thoroughly and comprehensively debunked by actual Assyriologists and Sumerologists, by scholars who have devoted their careers to learning these ancient languages, who have studied under recognized experts, who have published their work in peer-reviewed venues where other specialists evaluate their methodologies and conclusions. Let me walk through the specific issues, because these problems completely undermine the credibility of the ancient astronaut theory. First, as we've already established, the translation of Anunnaki itself that forms the cornerstone of Sitchin's entire interpretation is demonstrably wrong. This isn't a matter of scholarly interpretation or theoretical framework. It's basic linguistics, straightforward etymology. Second, the claim about gold mining that serves as the central motivation for the Anunnaki's presence on Earth in Sitchin's narrative. According to Sitchin, the Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki coming to Earth specifically to mine gold, engaging in extensive mining operations that required the creation of human workers. However, when we search the actual Sumerian corpus, when we examine the thousands of texts available in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature and in published collections, we find absolutely no references to gods mining gold. The word gold appears in Sumerian texts, certainly, but always in contexts related to temple decoration, royal treasuries, divine statues, and offerings to the gods, never to mining operations conducted by the gods themselves. Sitchin never provided a specific textual citation, never pointed to a particular line in a particular tablet that describes gods engaged in mining precious metals. This pattern of fabrication or extreme mistranslation repeats throughout his work. Third, the interpretation of Sumerian art and iconography. Ancient astronaut theorists point to various cylinder seals and relief carvings, claiming these depict spacesuits, rocket ships, and solar systems with extra planets including Nibiru. but actual archaeologists and art historians who have devoted their careers to studying Mesopotamian visual culture, who understand the symbolic language and iconographic conventions of ancient Near Eastern art, identify these images very differently and more accurately. The winged discs that appear frequently in Mesopotamian art, for instance, which Sitchin interpreted as spacecraft or flying vehicles, actually represent specific deities, particularly solar gods. The wings symbolize the god's ability to move across the sky, to bring light from horizon to horizon. They're symbolic representations of divine power and presence, not technical drawings of vehicles. Fourth, and perhaps most damaging to Sitchin's credibility, is the planet Nibiru itself. Sitchin claimed that the Sumerians and later Babylonians knew about this additional massive planet in our solar system, a body with an orbit so eccentric that it spends most of its time in the outer reaches, but periodically swings close to Earth every 3,600 years. Astronomers and astrophysicists have pointed out numerous insurmountable problems with this planetary scenario. A planet with the mass and orbital characteristics that Sitchin described would be gravitationally unstable in the solar system. Its passage through the inner solar system every few thousand years would cause massive disruptions to the orbits of the known planets. We would see clear evidence in countless ways, but we don't see any such evidence. Moreover, if Nibiru existed with the characteristics Sitchin claimed, modern telescopes and space probes would have detected it by now. We've surveyed the sky extensively using instruments far more powerful than anything available when Sitchin was writing. We've identified countless distant objects in our solar system, including dwarf planets in the Kuiper belt far beyond Pluto. If Nibiru existed, we would know about it. The absence of any such detection, despite decades of intensive astronomical observation using increasingly sophisticated instruments, is absolutely decisive. NASA and other major space agencies have explicitly stated multiple times that there is no evidence whatsoever for the existence of Nibiru or Planet X as described by Sitchin. No such event has occurred because Nibiru doesn't exist. Now I want to address a question you might be asking. Why does this matter so much? If people find the ancient astronaut theory entertaining or inspiring, what's the harm? The harm is that it does a profound disservice to the actual Sumerians and to their genuine intellectual and cultural achievements. When we attribute their accomplishments to alien intervention, we're essentially saying that ancient people weren't capable of developing civilization on their own, that they needed outside help to achieve what they achieved. This is not only insulting to ancient peoples, it's demonstrably false. The archaeological record shows us clearly how Sumerian civilization developed gradually over thousands of years through human ingenuity, hard work, and cultural innovation. Moreover, the ancient astronaut narrative encourages a dangerous form of thinking, where any claim that sounds dramatic or challenges conventional wisdom is automatically accepted without critical examination, where expertise and scholarly consensus are dismissed as closed-mindedness or conspiracy, where evidence and methodology don't matter as long as the story is compelling. But beyond these concerns, I think there's something else at stake. The real story that the Sumerian texts tell, when we read them authentically and carefully, is actually far more interesting and meaningful than the ancient astronaut fiction. These texts represent humanity's earliest recorded attempts to understand the deepest questions about existence. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? What is our place in the cosmos? How did civilization begin? What obligations do we have to forces greater than ourselves? The Sumerians developed sophisticated theological and philosophical frameworks to address these questions. They created rich mythological traditions that influenced later Mesopotamian cultures and, through various channels, contributed to the religious and literary heritage that eventually shaped Western civilization. Their creation myths describe a graduated cosmology, a universe that came into being through recognizable stages, moving from primordial waters through the separation of heaven and earth, from the birth of the first generation of gods to the proliferation of divine beings, from the creation of humanity to the establishment of civilization. They portray gods who were not distant and removed from the world, but actively involved in its operation, establishing order where chaos threatened, assigning responsibilities to ensure cosmic maintenance. These gods had personalities as complex as any human. They made mistakes, acting impulsively or without full knowledge of consequences. They engaged in contests and conflicts with each other. They felt emotions ranging from love to jealousy to rage. The texts reveal how the Sumerians understood their own civilization, seeing it not as a purely human achievement, but as fundamentally dependent on divine gifts, on knowledge and techniques that had been granted by the gods rather than discovered through human ingenuity alone. By attributing these foundational technologies to divine origins, the Sumerians were emphasizing their sacred importance, marking them as essential to human flourishing, protecting them from casual abandonment or thoughtless modification. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to thank you. I know this has been a long and detailed exploration, very different from the quick, sensationalized content that dominates so much of YouTube. But I believe that ancient history and authentic scholarship deserve this kind of careful attention. The Sumerians and their texts deserve to be read and appreciated for what they actually say, for the genuine insights they offer into ancient thought and culture, not for what modern theorists wish they said. If you found value in this investigation into what the Sumerian texts actually reveal, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content that examines ancient mysteries with intellectual honesty, scholarly rigor, and genuine respect for the evidence. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of Sumerian mythology do you find most fascinating? Where are you watching from tonight? What drew you to this topic? I genuinely love hearing from everyone who joins these journeys into the ancient past, learning what questions you bring and what perspectives you hold. And if you know someone who's been influenced by the ancient astronaut narrative, someone who might benefit from learning what these texts actually say, please consider sharing this video with them. Not to attack their beliefs, but to offer them the opportunity to engage with authentic ancient sources. The past is rich and complex and endlessly fascinating when we approach it with curiosity, critical thinking, and respect for what ancient peoples actually thought and believed. You don't need to add aliens or advanced technology to make ancient history interesting. The real story is profound enough on its own. Until next time, may your journey through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity, guided by evidence, and enriched by authentic wonder at what our ancestors actually achieved and believed.